And the latter part of verse 23 says, do here in Mayberry what we heard you did in Capernaum, so to speak. Do here in our town what we heard you did in Capernaum. In other words, when Jesus said this parable, Doctor, cure yourself, he understood what the crowd really wanted from him that day. He was their hometown boy. He had been traveling all about the region and the cities, doing all kinds of good and gracious and wonderful works everywhere else but in Mayberry, you know. I mean, why take all of those deeds of wonder and power? Why bring all kinds of tonics and cures to other people when the hometown, the beloved, the chosen city, why not bring it here first? Then Jesus went on to say what he'd said, at least in all the other Gospels. And if we're students of Scripture, we know this is not the first time that this appears. No prophet is welcome in a prophet's hometown. Jesus had this signature teaching style, and we know it. We know it well. He liked to speak in parables and riddles. He loved to tease and mess up people's minds so they could learn for themselves. We understand about teaching and talking in riddles and parables ourselves. We do it all the time. I had a counselor that used to say to me, and he still says today, behind every joke is a little seriousness. Now, I want you to think about that. How often do we doctor something up or dress something up that we know is going to be hard for somebody to hear? So we just dolly it all up, and we find some way to say it so it can be heard better. Do you have anybody in your life who every time they talk to you, particularly about a serious matter, they laugh? They laugh at the whole thing? I've got people like that in my life. One in particular who I always know when the hard stuff's coming because they're laughing their head off and it's not even funny. The point is, we don't like to say difficult things. Sometimes we probably need to be more attentive to people who joke around with us constantly to wonder, is there something behind that? Now, I don't want to make you all paranoid, but maybe you're missing something too. This principle applies that of trying to hide behind our words, whether we're children who are just coming into our own or whether we're adults who are trying to stay underneath the radar screen and who just don't want to speak the truth as we see it. Now, some might say that Jesus was doing the same thing. He was just kind of dressing up before he packed the real punch, and maybe they wouldn't catch what he was really saying, and maybe they would spend the rest of their day in the temple trying to figure out what that proverb meant, but I really don't think so. I think Jesus meant for it to be intentionally caustic. I think he did. I think he meant to do it in the same spirit that Paul did when he said to the church at Corinth that God chose what was foolish in this world to shame the wise and what was weak in the world to shame the strong. In the end, we find out that we're not as sharp and cunning as we think we are. And that, as Paul says, that even God's weakness is stronger than our strength. The prophet Isaiah said it like this: my ways are higher than your ways, and my thoughts are higher than your thoughts. God does not think like we think, and we're foolish for thinking he does. Now, Jesus chose some very interesting stories to illustrate his points that day. He could have chosen something a lot less innocuous, but boy, he chose two humdingers to offer a teaching point. Now, I want us to look at those very briefly. First, he chose the passage about a widow. He said there were many Israel widows in the time of Elijah when there was a famine in the land for some 42 months. Many, many widows. But you know, Elijah only went to one of them to help them out. And do you know who it was? It was a widow from Sidon. You know, she was on from the other side of the tracks. She had a lot of things working against her for those who were in the temple that day listening. First of all, she was a woman. Second of all, she was a widow. Thirdly, she was sonless. She'd lost her son. And fourth, she was a non-Jew. Okay? Man, their ire was raising. Well, the second story is really no different. He tells them the story this time that in the time of the prophet Elisha, who was the successor of Elijah, that there were many lepers in the land. Many lepers. You know what leprosy was back in that day? It was HIV/AIDS today. That's what it was. I mean, that's the banish them to the community, excommunicate them from the church kind of disease. There were many lepers in that day, and Elisha, he only went to one of them. And you know which one it was? Naaman, the leper, the Syrian. You know, also from the other side of the tracks. Do you get a sense of why the people in the temple, they're not liking what they're hearing? So quickly, as quickly as they said wonderful, gracious, wonderful things about Jesus, the tables turned. I wonder if you've discovered that in your own life. How quickly the tables turn, perhaps with a family member or with a friend or with a spouse. And everything is fine and wonderful and good, and the next minute, we're not even sure why. The tables have turned, and somebody's ready to run us up the streets and out of town and up to the edge of the cliff. That quickly, their tempers rage because this hometown boy, the carpenter's son, you know, Joseph, who lived around the block, the one that had us spellbound, is now speaking out against Mayberry. And it just won't do. I think as we close out, I want us to try to understand how this might have felt for those who were in the temple listening to what Jesus said that day. I want us to think about it, girls. Deep inside, whether we admit it or not, there's not a one of us here that doesn't like being a little bit of a princess. And by that I mean that we either like to think we look like one, at least some of the time, or that we're noticed like one, or we're somebody's beloved.